This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, starts off today's show discussing using an IRA for farmland, using a 401k retirement account for startup capital, and gifting property that still has debt. Keeping the show rolling is K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre as she explains if wheat growers need to be concerned about stripe rust. She also touches on other diseases wheat growers could see. The Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Bob Larson, Phillip Lancaster, Dustin Pendell, and Brian Lubbers in the show as they share thoughts on prolapses in cattle. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking through some estate and transition planning with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here today, Shelby.
Roger, you recently wrote an article titled Estate and Transition Planning Potpourri, and one of the things within this article talks about potentially putting farmland in an IRA, and why might that be something that someone does?
Because you have a lot of bad ideas floating through your head, and this is one of those really bad ideas. Don't do it. It's not to say that you can't. You can. But it's really kind of a bad idea because once you put the farmland in an IRA, you really can't do anything about it. You'll trigger a whole bunch of problems if you do, particularly if you want to continue farming the land. You can't do that if it's in an IRA. So, but there are those groups out there that push this concept, and I get questions from farmers, this looks pretty attractive, what I'm being sold here. Should I put my farmland in an IRA? Seems like a good investment vehicle, and my answer to that is don't do that. If you do it, you better go into it with both eyes open. And many times the land that you would put in there is financed, and that creates another problem too, because it'll cause the IRA to become fully taxable, which you do not want to have happen. And there's a lot of actions that are prohibited when land is in an IRA.
And when you say they can't do anything on that land, do you really mean nothing?
You can't farm the land, and that's what, if you want to farm the land, do not put it in an IRA. You're going to create a whole bunch of bad tax consequences if you do that. You can't even personally do any work on the land, such as mowing grass or maintaining waterways or painting a barn or doing any maintenance. You just have to keep your hands off, and that's next to impossible for many farmers to do that. You can rent it, but that rent better be based on fair market value. And if you borrow funds to buy the land, as I said, and then you put that in the IRA, you cannot personally guarantee the debt. And so if you do finance the purchase, part of your rental income is going to be, if you rent the land, then some of your rental income is going to be subject to income tax, and the IRA is going to have to file an income tax return. So you have another complication there. And if you put the farmland in an IRA, you're going to have a custodian, an IRA custodian, handle the transaction and the ongoing ownership of the land, and you're going to have to pay fees. The land's going to have to be appraised every year, and then once you turn 73, you may need to partially distribute the land annually. It's just a mess.
So overall, don't do it.
Don't do it. Go take a cold shower and change your mind.
And while we're thinking about different numbers and letters that go along with finances, 401k, and how could someone use that when it comes to farming?
One of the prohibitions that many people find difficult, particularly younger people in getting started in farming, is the capital requirements to start. Agriculture is a very capital-intensive business, and that's a significant drawback to farming on a full-time basis for people. But what I'm saying here in my article is that for people that have been around a while, not necessarily young people, but others that want to get started in farming or expand an operation, for instance, you might already have a substantial asset that you could tap to create that necessary working capital. And that's what I'm talking about. If you have a 401k retirement account, you might be able to use those funds to start a farming business. Now, to do that, you're going to have to create a C corporation to establish a 401k plan in that C corporation and then roll over your current 401k at your old employer into the new 401k plan. And then what happens is that the new plan buys shares in the corporation and becomes an owner. So the money you put into the corporation then becomes the working capital that corporation can use to buy equipment and plant crops and acquire land and livestock as well as other assets that you're going to farm with.
Are there some legal and tax things that people really need to keep in mind if they choose to do this?
Well, there are. First of all, there's no limit on how much stock in the corporation the 401k can buy. So that means, unlike borrowing money from a 401k, which is limited to $50,000, or cashing in the plan and paying taxes and a 10% penalty on the funds received, that means that you can put a significant amount of capital into the farm business in a pretty tax-efficient manner. So if you do it right and you follow the rules, this can work pretty well. However, there are some drawbacks. You don't want to be overly aggressive with the strategy. The IRS has noted abuses with this concept. So don't think you can set up a corporation simply to buy it. I use an example in my article is you use it to buy a motorhome. Don't do that. You want to use it for business purposes because if you buy a motorhome and you get audited, that's going to be disallowed on the audit. But if you use the cash to create a farming entity and will be actively farming, there's no issue with using a 401k to fund it.
And if someone does use a 401k to fund their farming business and get it started, does that cause issues for maybe passing down to the next generation?
Well, if you do it right and pay attention to the rules, the answer is no. It can be a part of your overall legacy plan, but you have to make sure you stay on top of this to preserve your farming or ranching legacy for your heirs. So if you want to do this, the key with preserving that legacy is don't delay, because we never know how much sand is in the top of each of our hourglasses. And the sooner you get a plan put in place, even if it doesn't include the use of a 401k to fund your operation, the better off you're going to be. And then modify that plan as time goes by because your situation changes, your facts change, your family structure changes, your goals and objectives change. So keep on top of that plan and don't just set one up and have it cast in stone.
And as things are changing, sometimes property that gets gifted, when there's still debt on that property, and when might this be something that happens?
Well, gifting property usually doesn't cause us a problem with respect to a succession plan. In fact, it can be part of a good succession plan overall. Now, it's less popular now than it has been in the past because the federal estate tax exemption is much higher than in the past. So often we don't want to gift property, and that's not the advice to people because you want to, at death, own that property to get a step-up basis in the hands of the heirs. Gifted property doesn't get a stepped-up basis. It has a carryover basis. But you may want to gift for other reasons rather than just tax minimization. You may want to see an heir enjoy ownership of an asset before you're gone. So gifting without debt usually causes no issue for us, but we got the basis carryover issue. But if the gifted property doesn't have a cost basis, and, if you're gifting a line of machinery out, for example, that you fully depreciated out, you don't have a cost basis in it. But if there's debt against that, then you're going to trigger income. So you may still have a loan on a piece of equipment. You've depreciated it out, still have a loan on it because it has value. Now you gift that, and it's got debt on it. You're going to trigger income tax. So let's say that Dad has a fully depreciated tractor that still has $100,000 debt on it. If he gifts the tractor to his daughter, for example, he's going to have to pay tax on $100,000 worth of gain because that's treated as a sale. Now, while Dad could continue to owe the debt, he would need to make sure that he has the income to pay it. So it just creates a lot of complications if there's debt on gifted property.
In that example, does it create issues for the daughter?
Not for the daughter. It's Dad that's going to recognize the income. The only issue for the daughter is that she's going to get Dad's basis in the tractor, which in my example is zero. So if she were then to sell the tractor, she would recognize gain at that on the full amount of the sale value.
What about in partnership scenarios of gifting property?
Well, there are many zero-basis farm assets that are held in a partnership. That could include grain inventories, prepaid inputs, machinery, equipment. We could have that in a partnership. But the partnership might also have debt, too. So a gift of a partnership capital account, we got the same problem. That's going to trigger tax on the amount of the negative capital account. Now, what solves that? death. Death, step-up basis, that's going to solve the problem. That's going to wipe out the negative capital account that can then be gifted to the next generation. So debt, bottom line here, Shelby, is that debt on farm assets does complicate farm succession planning and can create some negative tax consequences. If we don't deal with debt, if we don't have to deal with debt, it's much easier to satisfy clients' goals and objectives when it comes to succession planning and legacy planning.
And as we round out today's conversation and talking about your article, one point in here talking about transitioning the farm or ranch business and a few questions and maybe thoughts if there's not an heir or the next generation to take over.
Well, some states have matching programs, and I know there are some informal ways that we do this in Kansas of trying to find a next generation farmer that's interested in farming, someone that's younger, wants to get into farming but can't find a farm. So if you don't want to sell out, if you don't want to put a conservation easement on your farm, you want somebody to farm it, then there are some programs that you can tap into to try to find that person that could farm for the next generation. But in any event, when you're transferring to the next generation and your intent is that your operation stay as a farm, make sure you transfer it to somebody that knows what they're doing. We may have multiple children and we want to treat them equally, but when it comes to farming, that may not be the best asset to give them. Give them cash and leave the land and the control to the on-farm heirs, and that goes a long way in solving a lot of problems.
And simply, sometimes also, when you pass on the business, retirement is an okay thing, but might be difficult for farmers and ranchers.
Well, you also need to have an exit plan. The last thing that the next generation wants is your unsolicited advice until you die. So I know that's hard for people in many situations to step aside and watch a son or a daughter take over the operation. But that's kind of an art to it. You got to be able to exit and transition things, and that's important in many situations and can cause problems in some situations if you don't do that.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Oh, good to be here, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. I will link this blog article in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about stripe rust with K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Kelsey, you've been receiving a lot of questions about this wheat disease, stripe rust, and why is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the top most important diseases of wheat in Kansas year to year. So it's naturally on a lot of producers' minds right now as we're approaching the heading and boot stages in the southeast corner of the state, and then moving into our flagleaf growth stages in central and north central Kansas. This is a disease that's on everyone's mind, right? Because the big question is, do I need to spray a flagleaf fungicide application or not, right?
Have some of the recent weather conditions maybe spurred some more phone calls your way? I
think so, right? So we've kind of had perfect, I guess, stripe rust weather, right? We have the misty mornings and a lot of dew, cool weather. So I think this question is naturally on everyone's mind. Some good news is that the disease risk in Kansas for stripe rust remains very low across the state, right? So that's the high-level message, right? If you hear nothing else, it's that we still have low risk for stripe rust being a big problem in Kansas this year. And I can walk through a couple of those reasons why, right?
And why is that, Kelsey? We talked a little bit about this before, but what are those reminders?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I was on a month ago and we talked about Texas first, right? So kind of funny that we talk about Texas here in Kansas, but that's where our stripe rust survives the winter, right? Can't survive here, so it has to work its way back like a snowbird and make its way up the plains every year. And so a couple of key things. Conditions in Texas were very dry over the winter, right? So not very conducive for stripe rust development. And we didn't get reports out of Texas of stripe rust until a little bit later, right? Late March. And levels remained low there just because the weather conditions were pretty dry in Texas. So that's the first piece of good news, and that's the first thing that indicated that we probably would have a lower striped rust year here in Kansas. The other big piece is that striped rust has been very quiet in the southern Great Plains, right? So we had just now I heard a report of very low levels of striped rust in southwest Oklahoma. Right. But that's the first report I've even heard out of Oklahoma. Right. And that's very late for us. Right. And then we haven't to date had any reports of striped rust in Kansas. Right. So that is actually good news. We have a rule of thumb, Shelby, where if striped rust is detected in Kansas before April 15th, it's usually an indicator that it could be a bad year, right, in Kansas. But here we are. It's late April. We have not detected striped rust in Kansas. So there's just a low chance that it's going to be able to catch up to us at this point in crop development.
Can we still find striped rust even though it's after April 15th?
We could, yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if we do find some late season striped rust. We'll certainly keep scouting. We do, again, have conditions for striped rust. But the chance that we're going to have a big outbreak and yield limiting striped rust is getting lower and lower every day as we move into the season and into flag leaf, right? So it'd be a good idea to keep scouting, of course. We always suggest scouting your fields, watching the weather, watching reports, but all the signs are indicating now that it will be a low striped rust year in Kansas.
And as a reminder, what does striped rust look like in the wheat crop?
Yep. So this one is pretty easy to distinguish. It causes those characteristic yellow stripes on the wheat leaves, and you can tell it apart from other stresses because it produces these yellow spores that actually, if you run your finger across the leaf, it'll come up off on your finger, right? It'll turn your finger kind of a Cheeto dust orange color, right? So it's pretty easy to tell it apart from some of the other diseases and stresses we have on the wheat crop.
So overall recommendation, probably don't need to go in the field if people are concerned about striped rust?
Yeah, so right now, typically if we have some striped rust building in the field at low levels, that's where we would recommend a fungicide application. But since no striped rust has been reported in Kansas, it would probably be safe to hold off on that flag leaf fungicide application.
Are there other rusts that Kansas wheat growers could be seeing?
So that's a great point, Shelby. So in Texas, we have had reports of leaf rust and maybe slightly higher levels this year than stripe rust. Now, leaf rust, as a reminder, is a rust that likes warmer weather. So stripe rust likes it a little cooler. We usually see it first. Leaf rust usually shows up later in the season, prefers warmer weather. So I wouldn't be surprised if we do see some late season leaf rust coming in, but it could still be too late to cause yield damage. That's something we're going to keep watching and keep scouting for over the next couple of weeks.
What does leaf rust look like?
Yep, so leaf rust looks similar to stripe rust, except it's a more cinnamon brown color. So stripe rust is a more orangey yellow. Leaf rust is a more cinnamon brown colored rust. And the key difference is stripe rust usually only grows between the veins of the wheat leaf. So you get yellow spores, but they are limited by the veins. That's why they form these stripes along the leaf. Leaf rust doesn't have that same limitation, so it appears like more of a scatter shot across the leaf. You see these brown spots, and when you, again, rub your finger on the top of the leaf, you get that orange-brown spore mass on your fingers, and that's kind of a key way to tell leaf rust and stripe rust apart.
Any concerns with stem rust this year?
Well, let's keep an eye out for stem rust. That's usually our rust of the rust trifecta we have, that's the one that arrives latest. It likes the hot, late season temperatures. But on varieties that are susceptible, like some of our coaxium varieties that we have out in the state, or our varieties that have Colorado state backgrounds, like Langan or Avery, those varieties might have some more susceptibility, right? So late in the season, it might be a good idea to watch out for stem rust. But as of now, we have not had any reports of stem rust or stripe rust here in Kansas.
Any other concerns while we're thinking about the wheat crop?
So the big one we're going to start keeping track of now is scab risk, right? So if we can move past that flag leaf window and we don't need a stripe rust fungicide application, now we need to start thinking about scab, right? So we have had some misty, wet weather, right, over the last few days in parts of Kansas. So this weather is starting to look good for scab development, right? So let's keep an eye on it as we're moving into flowering. We'll put out some updates about how high the risk is, kind of depending on how the weather shakes out in the next week or two. But it could shape up to be a year where we need to watch that scab risk a little bit carefully, especially if we keep on trend for some of this wetter, high humidity weather. That's really important for scab. Key reminders, scab is at highest risk when you're after or right near no-till corn stalks, right? So if you planted your wheat back into corn residue, that would be a high-risk scenario for scab. So you should be really mindful of the weather moving into the flowering phase of development. And the other really important thing about scab is it only affects the wheat crop, or it causes the most damage at flowering, right? So when we get into flowering, that's really our key time to make a fungicide application for scab. And that, as we know in Kansas, is a very short window, right? So we do need to be mindful of our timing for a scab fungicide application.
Could this be a good time for growers to go back and look at their varieties and see how susceptible they are to everything?
Absolutely. So, double checking the Kansas Wheat Variety Guide for susceptibility and resistance would be a great idea right now. If you're going back into corn stalks and you do have a variety that's moderate for scab, you could be okay if scab levels are relatively low, right? But if they are high, if we have really perfect conditions, we can still benefit from a fungicide when we have high risk for scab. If we have a susceptible variety going back into corn stalks and we do have good weather for scab, right? So high humidity, misty rains prior to flowering, then we definitely want to consider a fungicide application. And a lot of our varieties are susceptible. So you're right, Shelby. It's a really great time to just go back, take a peek at your Kansas Wheat Variety Guide, and see what kind of resistance profile you have on your variety.
Kelsey, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
That was Kansas State University wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre discussing stripe rust and if Kansas wheat growers should be concerned about it. Kelsey mentioned that they will be tracking different diseases in Kansas, and a great way to stay up to date with what they're tracking and seeing is by subscribing to the weekly Agronomy eUpdate newsletters. You can do that by heading over to their website at eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Again, that is eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Also in the show notes will be K-State's Wheat Variety Guide, along with different publications that people can use to identify what wheat disease could be in their fields. Of course, all this once again can be found at agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. We end today's show of Agriculture Today with the Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Bob Larson, Phillip Lancaster, Brian Lubbers, and Dustin Pendell on part of their Cattle Chat podcast.
Vaginal prolapses that we sometimes see pre or post calving. And Bob, I'll start with you. What causes those?
Well, basically, it is an elevation in estrogen. So late pregnancy is associated with prolapse, and there are some breed dispositions because some of it has to do with the integrity of the whole musculature around the back end there is actually quite complicated and have less structural integrity in some individuals. So when we see some prolapses, usually it's associated with certain breeds, certain individuals, and late in pregnancy. Now, occasionally you'll see a group or handful of females that have a vaginal prolapse at a time that doesn't make sense, and then we start looking at feedstuffs, and we're looking for a legume that's particularly high in estrogens, or even a mycotoxin or something like that that has some estrogenic activity. So I'll put Phillip on the docket here as far as what might cause some vaginal prolapses outside of late pregnancy.
Yeah, well, so a lot of our, some of our soy products, some of the legumes, like you said, can have some high phytoestrogens, and then, some of the mycotoxins, like some of the ergots and other things like that would be in seed heads or something like that, can produce some phytoestrogen. So they could get some high levels through some of those different ways.
But we typically don't worry about that unless we have more of an outbreak type scenario,
Those
a handful of them.
Not common, but you see them every once in a while where you get a handful like that.
And you could see those pre or post calving, or would most of those be pre calving?
Pre calving, although again with these phytoestrogens, it can happen in non-pregnant heifers. So it can be, and that's where I'm almost always thinking late in pregnancy, but before the calf is born, and then these other odd situations, just like, I don't expect to see that in that group of cattle.
Brian, could you describe how do I distinguish a vaginal prolapse from other types of prolapses, and what is the typical solution?
So, pretty typical way to tell the difference is just do an exam, right? So kind of the three we think about, we could have rectal prolapse, vaginal prolapse, or uterine prolapse. And again, like Bob said, vaginal prolapse is usually late pregnancy, uterine prolapse right after calving typically, and then rectal prolapse kind of about any time, heifers and steers, right? And usually those rectal prolapses we associate with a lot of intra-abdominal pressure, straining, something like that. So that's, like I said, about any time with those, but it's an exam, right? Which part of the anatomy is prolapsing? So, and
then this fix for vaginal prolapses?
The fix for vaginal prolapse would just basically replace it back, and you probably would put in some sort of suture. There's a couple different ways you could suture the external vulva closed. The thing with that is it kind of depends on which way you fix that. Depends on how closely you can monitor that heifer if that happened pre-calving, because we want to make sure that you're either able to assist or she's able to calve through that suture.
Yeah. So I've got a quick question. So if cow has one, are they going to likely to have it again?
That's a great question, actually. And with vaginal prolapse, we do think that there is the likelihood that she's at higher risk. And so usually we put a cow with a vaginal prolapse on the cull list. So finish this calving, raise this calf, but she goes on the cull list. A uterine prolapse, not necessarily associated with a greater risk of doing that in the future, other than, sometimes those cows are slower to breed back and you run into other problems, but it's not the same genetic link.
Yeah, and the other thing with the uterine prolapse is, depending on the degree of damage to the uterus, that may be an animal you want to think about culling. Not because she's necessarily at higher risk for the prolapse, but like Bob said, it's either going to be a delayed pregnancy or no pregnancy because of essentially complications. But the rectal prolapse, those are usually not a hereditary basis. So once you get that corrected, you correct the underlying cause, probably okay.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. You can hear the full episode by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching for Cattle Chat on your favorite podcast platform. That's all I have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.